Hello.
Hello, please.
Yeah, what's the problem, sir?
We just drove down our farm track.
Yeah.
Go and feed our pheasants. We come across a Range Rover with 3 people in it.
Yeah.
It appears that they're dead. I don't know what's happening. Blood in the motor all over them.
Welcome back to a new video on the Essex Boys case. As always, if you are enjoying the content, please do give the video a thumbs up. And if you're interested in the Essex Boys case or simply true crime in general, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. And in this video, we're going to take a look at the events which took place after these murders were committed. We're going to take a look at the relationship between Michael Steele and the supposed getaway driver Darren Nichols, and also some further inconsistencies regarding Darren Nichols' version of events for the night of the murders. Firstly, we'll start with a couple of pages from Blogs 19, where Darren Nichols describes in his own words some events which took place on December the 6th, 1995. After dropping Jack Worms off, Darren Nichols had driven down the road past several tempting pubs and parked on the side of the road to wait for Jack to call him. In Nichols' own words, "I checked my phone and saw it wasn't picking up much of a signal, so I decided to move. I ended up driving back past the lane and then took the first turning on the left. I went down there a little way and turned around, so I ended up parked on a bit of a hill. I looked at the phone again to check the signal, and at that very moment it started to ring. It was Jack. 'Come and get us,' he said. 'That was quick,' I replied, but the line had already gone dead. He had hung up. I retraced my steps and pulled into the lane and immediately turned the car around. Almost straight away, Jack was at the back door of the car and got in, sitting down in the darkness. 'Where's Mick?' I asked. 'He won't be long. He's dropped something. Doesn't want to leave it there,' said Jack. And then he made this really weird sound, a bit like a series of quiet little snorts. I could just make out his silhouette in the rear-view mirror, and his big shoulders were bobbing up and down. It took me a while to work out what was going on. Jack was giggling. I was still looking at Jack in the rear-view mirror when Mick appeared and opened the front passenger door. As soon as he did, the interior light came on, and that's when I saw Jack's hands. He was wearing surgical gloves, and they had been splashed with streaks of blood, and on the back of one of them was a lump of greyish slime, surrounded by lumps of hair and skin and more blood. 'Turn that fucking light out,' screamed Mick. I didn't think. I just went into autopilot and started scrabbling about on the roof of the car trying to find the light switch. But as Mick sat down, he shut the door and the light went off anyway. And then suddenly, it was pitch black again. I could still see Jack's hands, and I could still see the blood and the bits of brain, and I felt like someone had sucked all the air out of me, because I wanted to speak. I desperately wanted to say something, but no matter how I tried, I just couldn't get any words out. Mick told me to get going, and though my mind was elsewhere, my body somehow obeyed, putting the car into gear and moving off towards the main road. From then on, everything happened in slow motion. I saw the headlights, heard the screech of tyres, and braced myself for the impact. But it never came. Mick had grabbed the steering wheel at the last moment and wrenched it to one side, avoiding a crash by just a few inches. The other driver flashed his lights and swore at me out of his half-open window. I just pulled out onto the main road without looking, but I honestly didn't know where I was or what I was doing. I just sat there like a zombie. 'For fuck's sake, Darren, drive carefully,' said Mick. 'What are you trying to do, kill us all?' Jack, sitting behind, thumped the back of my seat with his fist. 'Fucking arsehole,' he growled. I was still in shock, but I felt myself slowly coming back down to earth. I mumbled a half-hearted apology and carried on driving back towards the Rettendon Turnpike. All at once, I felt like I was going to be sick, that I had a splitting headache, that I was freezing cold and boiling hot. My mind was racing, but it kept coming back to me the fact I'd only been away for a couple of minutes. Surely they didn't have time to do anything. I desperately wanted to know exactly what had happened back there, but at the same time, I desperately didn't want to know anything about it. I just couldn't take it in. I wanted to pretend I hadn't seen anything or heard anything, but it wasn't going to happen. Mick turned to Jack and broke the silence. 'Those cunts won't be threatening us again,' he said. 'Too right,' came the reply. I was trying to concentrate on the road when a glint of metal caught my eye. I chanced a sideways glance and saw that Mick was passing Jack the barrels of a sawn-off shotgun, followed by the stock and the trigger mechanism, and then it got worse. Jack moved forward so he was sitting with his head between the two front seats, just the way that naughty kids do when they're little, and he and Mick started going over all the details of what they'd done. 'I tell you, Darren, it was well funny,' he said with a grin, 'cause Mick shot one of them, and then his gun fell apart, bits all over the place. That's what he was looking for, the thing he dropped. I couldn't believe it. There we were trying to do a job, and he spends half the time on the floor trying to find the fucking bits. By now, Mick was smiling too. "Did you shoot the back window by mistake?" he asked. Jack shook his head. "Nah, I think Pat must have done it with his hand. I'll never miss. Not from that distance anyway." Then Jack turned to me. "You should have seen him, Darren. It was pathetic. Hard man." Squealing like a little baby he was. I had absolutely no idea what to say or what to do. How do you respond to something like that? I felt as if I was no longer in the car. Just a spectator looking on and listening in. All I could think was, what the fuck am I doing here? What's going to happen now? Mick spoke again. "Hey, you'll never believe it, Jack. That soppy cow Sarah. She only phoned Pat's mobile just as we were going down the fucking lane. All that talk about how she hates him and wants him out of her life. And how pleased she'd be if something bad happened to him. And then there they are having this lovey-dovey chat. Made me want to throw up. To be honest, I was shitting myself. I was just waiting for him to say, 'Oh, I'm here with Mick and some of the lads.' And that would have been it. We'd have had to call the whole thing off. But he never did, thank fuck. I bet she'd kick herself if she knew how close she came to saving him." Jack grunted in agreement, and Mick continued. "Mind you, don't know how I'd stopped you. When we got to the bottom of the lane and the gate was locked, I didn't have a clue where the fuck you were until you handed me the gun and started shooting. I thought we'd blown it." I heard myself speak, my voice soft and low. "I hope I never upset you two." For some reason, Mick and Jack thought this was hilarious. The two of them fell about, absolutely pissing themselves. Although I knew the roads reasonably well, the state I was in meant that Mick and Jack had to give me instructions for every turn like I was some learner driver. Left at the swimming pool shop, left at the first set of traffic lights, down to the bottom, second on the right, into the car park of the Hungry Horse pub. I spotted Mick's Toyota Hilux pickup in the corner and pulled the Passat alongside. It was only when I tried to stand up that I realised how much I was shaking. Jack and Mick jumped out and started changing their clothes. They were still really animated and talking quickly, but I was no longer listening to what they were saying. It was then that I had noticed for the first time that they were wearing identical outfits, dark green boiler suits, Wellington boots and surgical rubber gloves, all of which were stuffed into a couple of bin liners and placed in the back of the truck. Jack took the Passat and drove off, while Mick got into the Hilux and waved me into the passenger seat. Then we set off for Mark's Tate where my own car was waiting. As soon as Jack had gone, Mick's mood changed. He was quieter, more thoughtful. He was obviously going over the evening's events in his mind. Then after a few minutes of silence, he suddenly said, "Jack's a cold-hearted bastard." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Well, the second I got out of the Range Rover, he leaned in with a pump action and shot the three of them. Boom, 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 just like that. Like it was nothing to worry about. He was just so detached, so emotionless. It was like he was serving up chips or something. But we had to do it together, you see. That way one of us could never give evidence against the other. We'd both be equally guilty. That was the deal." I said nothing. All day long I'd been dying for a beer, but now all I could think about was drinking half a bottle of whiskey to blot everything out. I suggested we both go for a drink, or three. At first Mick agreed, but by the time we got to Mark's Tate he had changed his mind and said it'd be best if we just go straight home. I knew my wife and kids would be expecting me, but I just couldn't face them. I pulled out my mobile and phoned my mate Rick. Told him I'd had a really shitty day and asked him if he could meet me down the pub. He stayed for a couple and we talked about any old bollocks, but then he had to go home to his girlfriend. In the end, I just stayed there on my own, sitting in a corner drinking myself into an absolute stupor. Okay, now a few things I want to just pick up on before we move on to the second part of this video, and that's what has been mentioned here in this book and also in his official statement under oath. Now, he mentions here that when Jack calls him, his response is, "Well, that was quick. I'll be there in a second." He gives the impression that the phone call comes like 2 or 3 minutes after he's been dropped off at the lane, but from the calculations that we've made, it's around about a 17-minute time difference between when Jack is dropped off at the lane to when he calls Nichols to be collected, around about 17 minutes give or take. The impression that Nichols gives in not only his official statement, not only his testimony in court, but also in his passages here in the book Blogs 19, is that his response is, "Oh, that was quick," as if it's been like 2 or 5 minutes since Jack's been dropped off. But what we need to factor in and what we need to remember most importantly is that Jack is dropped off at the lane. He goes down to the bottom of the lane and readies himself. The actual Range Rover hasn't even approached at this time. Nichols then drives off down the road towards the wheat sheaf. He then sits there for a period of time before realising that his mobile phone doesn't have a good enough signal where he's sat. So he then drives out of the wheat sheaf, back past the lane and parks up in one of the turnings on the left. So as I say, we're not looking at a very short time period here, say 2 to 5 minutes. We're looking at around 17 minutes between the time that Wholmes is dropped off at the lane and he calls Nichols to then go and collect them. But that's certainly not the impression that Nichols gives in his own words there. When he answers the phone and says, you know, well, that was quick, all right, I'll be there in a second, or whatever he says. He's giving the impression that this is literally just happened. He's just dropped Jack off and he's received a phone call almost straight away. But quite simply, that's not the case. Now, when we take a look at another instance, which I've just mentioned, and that is in Nichols' own words again, when he's leaving the lane or leaving the crime scene, there's a conversation between Steele and Wholmes. In that conversation, Steele is talking about the phone call from Sarah Saunders to Pat Tate. And he mentions that this actual phone call originates as they're going down the lane or starting to go down the lane. Now, we also know that that can't be true either, because in 2004, in Michael Steele's 2004 appeal, I should say, there was a mention of this phone call, and the fact that this phone call wasn't a short phone call of, say, 30 seconds to a minute. This phone call actually lasted just under 4 minutes in duration. Now, we don't have the raw call data for that actual call and its duration, but you have to surmise and believe that if it appears in an official 2004 appeal by the defence of Michael Steele, then there has to be some credibility to that phone call lasting just under 4 minutes in duration. Now, why is that even important, you may ask yourself? Well, the official narrative, the official version of events, and one which is told in a lot of documentaries, is that this phone call originates as the Range Rover is heading down the lane itself. But the call actually ends by the time the Range Rover reaches the locked 5-bar gate. Now, we know if the call duration is just under 4 minutes, then this version of events cannot be the truth, as the drive from the lane to the locked 5-bar gate is no more than, you would say, a 30-second drive at most. So that phone call either took place whilst they were on their way to the lane, or it was whilst they were at the lane and waiting for some time before they were actually killed. Now, something I just want to mention before we move on to the second part of this video, and this is actually completely unrelated to what I've just spoken about, but the actual planning of this murder. Now, imagine you are Michael Steele. You have told either Pat Tate or Tony Tucker to meet them at the lane, or there's going to be a meet that evening. They're most definitely going to be meeting you. You're going to look at this landing strip, etc., etc. Would you really tell anybody that you were going to murder and tell them where you were going to take them, where you were going to meet them, or even that you were meeting them that evening? Just imagine that from someone who is about to kill someone's point of view. You are talking to 3 loudmouth drug takers, drug addicts. You have every possibility or every chance that one of those individuals is going to tell either a loved one, one of their friends who they're meeting. Would you genuinely make such a stupid mistake as to openly discuss that you need to meet them that evening? You're going to be looking at a landing strip. It just sounds so far-fetched. From what we know of Steele, he does obviously take risk, but he's someone who's quite calculated. Would he really be making such a brazen appeal for them to meet them, that evening, knowing full well that he was also going to execute 3 individuals? Now, for the second part of this video, I just want to talk briefly about the aftermath of the murders and Darren Nichols himself. Now, again, let's put ourselves in Michael Steele's position. Let's look at the way that Nichols supposedly reacts after the murders have been committed. He was completely unaware, by all accounts, that he was going to be a getaway driver that evening. He nearly pulls out in front of a car. He's quite nervous. He's quite dishevelled. He then starts to disassociate himself with Steele as much as possible. He doesn't go on any further drug runs. And he really only sees Steele when he's called round to do some electrical work at Steele's home. Now, if Steele and Wholmes are in fact guilty of triple murder and the crime did play out very similar to the way that Darren Nichols described in court, then surely it must have crossed Michael Steele's mind that Nichols needed to be taken care of. He needed to be gotten rid of. You can tell by the way that Nichols reacts during the getaway itself, nearly pulling out in front of a vehicle, acting nervous, dishevelled, keeping his distance from Steele in the weeks following the murders. Now, Steele, being a calculated individual, would have thought that really Nichols is the weak link here. We also can go back to some of the previous newspaper reports which originated just days after the murders, saying that we'll more than likely find the getaway driver who will be the weak link in this case. Did this not scare Steele to some degree? Did it not make him quite anxious? Would it not have been better to have gotten rid of Nichols? In that way, really, they would have been home and dry. And I mean, how difficult would it have been for Steele to have tempted Nichols back out on that rib into the middle of the North Sea and simply dropped him off in the middle of it? You have to think that Steele, being the calculated individual that he was, would have been a little bit concerned about a loose end like Nichols roaming free, especially the way he had reacted after these murders had taken place. If Nichols is telling the truth and Nichols was an unwitting getaway driver that evening, then surely Steele must have been concerned about Nichols either being pulled in by the police or Nichols going to the police himself and telling all that he knew. We also know that Nichols refused to go abroad for Steele after the murders, claiming that his passport had run out. So really, what benefit was Nichols to Steele at this point? We already have the various newspaper articles with Ivan Dibley, the detective leading the case, talking about they were more than likely looking for 2, possibly 3 individuals. It will be the getaway driver who will be the weak link. That's the person that we're looking for. All of these things must have been going through Steele's mind. If Steele was responsible for these murders, I certainly believe he would have taken care of Nichols as well. It hardly makes a blind bit of difference committing triple murder to killing 4 people. By killing that 4th person, the one person who you deem to be a weak link in the chain between you, Womes and Nichols, you would have been actually a lot safer. So why was Nichols allowed to roam free? Is that because Steele wasn't actually responsible for this crime? Hence the reason he didn't take care of Nichols, he didn't do away with him. He invited him over at Christmas with his family. He invited him over to do electrical work after the murders had taken place. Now, the relationship between Steele and Nichols after the murders have taken place, I would describe as quite a casual one. It's certainly not overbearing on behalf of Michael Steele. He's not checking up on Nichols every hour. He's not checking up on him every 24 hours or every couple of days, seeing what he's up to, who he's with. He's not nervous. It doesn't appear to be nervous in any way in terms of what Nichols is up to or who he may be associating with. The relationship, as I say, appears quite casual. Nichols clearly states that he can't go abroad for Steele anymore, and Steele just appears to invite Nichols over to do some occasional electrical work. Now, if Nichols is telling the truth and Steele was responsible for this murder, I would have thought that Steele would have been keeping a little bit more of a closer eye on Nichols and what he may be up to, but we just don't get that impression. We just get the impression that this is a very relaxed, laid-back, sort of part-time friendship between Steele and Nichols after these murders take place. Now, we know from what we've read in the court transcripts or what was recovered from Steele's house, he had anti-bugging devices around his home. He liked to use a payphone because he was quite paranoid about his phone calls being listened into. We know that the phone calls from the undercover officers posing as IRA started on Thursday the 15th of February. Now, this was still some time before Steele, Womes and Nichols were all eventually arrested. During this time period, Steele was actually quite wary of these phone calls. This would have been ramping the pressure up on Steele even if he didn't necessarily show it on those phone calls. Now, observation on Steele supposedly started just a few days after the murders. According to the book Blogs 19, Ivan Dibley states that Steele came up on the radar just 36 hours after these murders were committed. It was then that they decided to put Steele under observation. So would Steele not have taken some action in order to really get rid of the one and only weak link who could send him and Jack down? Now, maybe Steele wasn't aware that he was under observation early on after the murders, but as soon as those calls start to originate around the 15th of February, some months before they are eventually all arrested, this would have tipped Steele off that something wasn't quite right. Yet his relationship towards Nichols during this time period and after this time period doesn't appear to change a great deal. Steele must have thought in the back of his mind, if he is indeed responsible for these murders, that Nichols has to go. He's the only person who could actually rat on him and Womes. But there doesn't seem to be a change in their relationship. There doesn't appear to be any threats towards Nichols directly. And I do find that a little bit strange considering what we know about Steele himself. So to summarise what we are left with when we take a look back at what happened after these murders were committed, Nichols' supposed erratic behaviour when leaving the lane and the drive from the crime scene itself, his sort of distancing from Steele in the days after the murders, the real press reports which originate just 48 hours after these murders are committed discussing the fact that we may be looking at 2, possibly 3 individuals involved in this murder. Also, the fact that the getaway driver may well be the weak link. The fact that Michael Steele was under observation early on in the investigation, just shortly after these murders took place. And also the phone calls which Michael Steele was very wary of, which originated on the 15th of February. All of these things should have tipped Steele off. From what we know of the man himself being a calculated person, he really would have taken care, I believe personally, of Nichols if he indeed was responsible for these murders. That is my own personal opinion. I don't believe Steele was someone who would have left a loose end like Nichols roaming free. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. If you're new to the channel, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. You should be able to see in front of you shortly some other videos from the channel, and also the Essex Boys playlist, which has all of the videos regarding this case in one convenient folder. Many thanks for joining me for this video. I look forward to seeing you all again in the next one. Take care. Cheers.